Hi, my name is Ethan Barnhart, and today we're going to be discussing building a remote team planning application that combines the strengths of EOS Traction from Gino Wickman's work, if you've heard of Traction or the Entrepreneurial Operating System, with Agile, a planning system that many people are familiar with. And this was done during the global pandemic, during my time at High Ground Cyber. And the way I'm going to be discussing this project is going to be a combination of the requirements gathering and BA work that had to happen, the design process and the iterative nature to get to the final application, and then the technical aspects of actually doing the work and implementing it with the tools that I use, the solution architecture, the application architecture, and then the final benefits of the application once it was in place and the team was using it. Now, if only one or two of those things interest you, feel free to skip around this video. There's no reason to consume all of it if you don't want to, or this video runs long. All right, so to jump in, any good project is going to start with a place of empathy. If you're building something new for people and you want people to really use it, what are they feeling? What are they saying? What are they thinking? And a lot of the high ground team members at this point in time were saying things like, resource costing per task and the margin performance of our accounts kind of feels like a black box. I don't really know what our margin contribution from an account was until I've done an entire month's worth of work and I'm looking back. Mundane time in back office activities and some lower level account management work feels too high. I don't particularly enjoy it. It wasn't in my job description and my life kind of sucks right now. And this is something that's more true of smaller teams. If you're on a team of 4 or 5 people, let's say, and you're the primary person responsible for an account, maybe you're the person who's doing consulting work and you're also correcting invoices or even doing accounting work. If that becomes 30, 40, 50% of your job, it's going to be a pretty big drain on morale. Day to day, it's just not an optimal reality for people. And another big one for this project, I can't see what others are doing. And if I need something from somebody, like I'm waiting on work from somebody else to get my work done, it might not even get done in the span of my sprint for something I can't even control. And the wait just completely derails my work in the meantime. Now, this is a huge deal for a lot of remote teams even today, and something we had to solve internally at High Ground, and one of the main impetuses for this application. Without estimates and actuals and the time being spent, it's impossible for me to plan the capacity for future work. High Ground Cyber is a consulting company, so you need to know how many accounts can you take on in a quarter, like what projects can you finish. Those kinds of things are the biggest drivers of your top line. So how can you know what your top line is going to be if you don't have this information? And if we're being honest with ourselves, we've talked about Traction for a long time. We really like Traction, but we can't run Traction realistically if we don't have task level data to pull together on our KPIs. We can't run an L10 without good KPIs. So Traction is a system operationally that you will impale yourself on if you don't have this underlying data in place. And by now we've done our VTO. We've had our 2 and 3 year roadmap laid out. We're all agreed on a shared strategic vision, but it's the maneuvering at the 6-month level, the 3-month level, week to week and day to day that has to be informed and has to be a recurring pattern based on good data in order for that to actually happen and us to use Traction effectively. So, with this locus of problems narrowing in, we can start defining requirements, define the problem. We need shared visibility on tasks. Now, High Ground was a remote team before it was cool, and then everyone moved to remote work during COVID, and this became a much greater priority. The organization wants to combine the strengths of EOS Traction and Agile, and the way that we did that internally is more of a culture problem, and it was a problem that we hadn't had solved at the time, but we solved it, and it's not really going to be the scope of this discussion how that happened, but you'll get to see where some of those seams meet in the way that the application was designed. And we need to quantify our wins and losses on productive time here rather than rely on how we feel about the work. Just because you don't particularly enjoy it, it's kind of gritty work, doesn't mean you weren't the right person to do it. It didn't need to happen or it wasn't value add, right? So the first step in terms of prototyping, I opted for a quick and dirty solution. We're just going to start with an online Excel workbook up in SharePoint or Microsoft 365 where everyone can see it and add to it and we can iterate. The core views in the final application that you're going to see later were produced originally as tabs here. If you're running Agile, you can't run Agile without a backlog, so that's where we start. We have a backlog tab where we're just running an inventory of all the work that needs to get done. Clients are going to ask for things. There's more work than there are people to do it, and we're going to hang various bits of information that we need on the task up in the backlog to that task. From there, you've got a refined backlog, just using the Agile planning methodology. a sprint planner or a manager is going to be able to pick things off of the pile and then assign them an owner, assign them a tentative sprint that we can get the work done in, priorities, and then solicit for estimates on best case, likely case, worst case for how long that task might take to complete. And then from there, it's going to get assigned to people in a sprint visualizer where you can see there's kind of a pull approach happening here. People are going to see their assigned pile of work within the span of a given sprint, and they can pull things off of the pile by priority, and everyone else can see what that day's to-do list looks like for all the team members across high ground. We've got sprint metrics, hugely important. We want to be able to measure the expected velocity that we had for that sprint versus what we actually managed to accomplish. And then we want to see what the variance between our estimates and our actuals, are we in control? Are we effectively estimating the work? And then if you squint, you can see in those rows underneath, we have a hit rate or completion rate by priority of the work to see that if the work being completed matches in descending order to the priority of the work that was assigned. If people are overburning in lower priority tasks, we would want to see that. We've also got resource metrics. If you've got a task that takes up half your sprint and still isn't done, we would want to see that. And if somebody's serially overburning or underburning, we would want to see that too. From here, we're going to address the management use cases, building off the concepts built in those other tabs, right? We're going to have a ROC scorecard, and that's traction terminology. It just means that it's an internal quarterly initiative that may or may not have any direct implications for something that's client-facing or customer-facing. These things are internal improvements being made, that they're new capabilities coming online. Things like the COVID-19 response plan you might see there, or maybe you're opening a new plant somewhere, or you're bringing on a new technology in your IT stack. Things of that nature are going to get assigned a budget internally for the quarter. We're going to burn against that budget. We're going to track the actual value attained throughout the lifetime of that project to see if we're on track or off track. We're going to have a quarterly velocity scorecard managing those same ROCs and quarterly initiatives using the same prior logic defined for the resources. We're going to have a quarterly resource scorecard because for a consulting shop or any professional services organization, people are going to have target billable utilization rates. How much of their time is being spent in front of a client doing billable activities. And if it's on target or off target, we would want to then know what other work inside of the shop is competing with that. And then what can we do to make course corrections so that you're able to hit your targets, everyone in the boat is happy, and we're still hitting our top line targets. From doing all of this prototyping work, we then arrive at feedback with some of the testing, and some of the new use cases we had shook out of all of this was that tasks are going to recur way more often than we initially anticipated, right? And creating a new task for every time that recurs is a massive pain for anyone who's doing sprint planning or management. It's going to be way too tedious. So this final application that we have is going to have to include some sort of recurring scheduler for tasks that we know are coming. There's no reason to do 2 and 3 instances of something that you know is coming every week. And high ground ran sprints on a weekly basis. Remaining work on tasks too would carry over from sprint to sprint, and that isn't a failure case in a lot of these situations. It's not the sprint planner's inability to effectively anticipate something or a resource's inability to complete the work that they were committed to. It's a client in the middle of your week dropping something on your plate that's immediately more urgent than anything else that you had planned beforehand. Or it's an emergency maintenance situation or something like that with one of your internal IT resources that requires you to drop everything else. And so if you were 60% of the way through a task that had an assigned allotment of hours, then we're just going to split that task along the line at which you left it and then take the remainder into the next sprint and you'll complete it then. From here, you can see updated requirements based off of the solicitation of all the initial requirements plus the feedback that we got, and really like operationally testing this internally as a team. We were running daily stand-ups and running sprint plans off of the Excel workbook before we ever really moved into the solution development, and that continued with us throughout the entire development process. I'm not going to go through the requirements here, but you can pause the video and read through them if you like. So let's get into the technical aspects now. We're using a solution architecture here that's relatively simple. It's assumed that every user is going to be a high ground employee, but the way that we validate that is they're coming in through the Azure front door, which is just a web application firewall, And they're either going to have an Azure identity in their browser session already, or they're going to walk through the MSAL sign-in workflow, which is pretty standard for any Microsoft application. They're going to sign into their Microsoft account. They're going to get sent a ping to their authenticator on their phone, and they're going to have a valid 2FA sign-in to access this planner application being hosted on an Azure Web Application Service. And it's accessing and changing data that's being stored up in an Azure SQL instance. Now, I, as the local developer on my machine, I'm authenticating using my Azure identity before I can access the code. I'm writing all of the code, and then I'm publishing to production from my machine and making Git commits up to our Azure version control instance, which is just GitHub under the hood. From here, you can see the rough outline on the application architecture. Now, I've broken this down into views, services, and objects. And if we go to objects, you can kind of see that sprints are the God level record. They're the parent record of authority for all of these other different aspects of the data that we care about inside the application. And everything to the right of a sprint more or less handles our Agile use cases, and everything to the left of it more or less handles our traction use cases. The services manipulate the data and pull in different respects. The Sprint Planner service handles most of the CRUD, that's create, read, update, and destroy use cases for cancellations, deferrals, scheduling, all the different things surrounding task data in our interactive views that the user sees on a daily or weekly basis. And then our traction and our reporting services interrogate the data from the sprint level, traversing across the object map here in different ways to compile and aggregate reporting views that you can see in blue. Quickly acknowledge the tools and frameworks used here. It's a relatively simple stack and pretty common for tools at that time. It was initially built in .NET Framework 4.7.2, since been retargeted to .NET 6 for long-term support. It's an application, an MVC application with Razor pages, and we were using libmin at the time for bundling and minification of all the content. And at the data level, Entity Framework, it's a pretty cut and dry ORM, especially for .NET applications. SQL Server Management Studio is kind of the de facto Microsoft interface with any SQL database. And with the front end, CSS3, HTML5, and jQuery were popular stack then and popular stack now. We use Kendo UI, which I've seen a bit of in the industry. It's not my first choice for data visualization or grid building. There's others that I would get into for some of the other projects I've built. And Foundation. Now, Foundation's definitely not as common. I don't see that one a lot, but you can think of it as a one-for-one with Bootstrap and what Bootstrap handles. It's just a little bit more dependent on Flexboxes. To walk through the timeline here, for all my college people out there, I would definitely recommend against taking a 20 credit hour semester, your final semester in college, taking on a project like this, and then also going through a global pandemic at the same time. It was rough. We all remember what March of 2020 was like. Now, I came out fine, project came out fine, but those slides that I showed earlier with the prototyping, those began in earnest during March of 2020 and continued all the way up into the May 2020 mark when we could properly start, swinging hammers and hanging sheetrock. The development took from May of 2020 through the summer months till about September of 2020 when I was ready to deploy internally. And throughout that entire time, if you go back and look at the screenshots, they're dated for like June. We were using and enhancing the Excel workbook and developing this solution internally kind of in tandem so that one could inform the other. And again, it's about operationalizing the whole process from a human perspective, but also just learning from that and having it inform the technical aspects of building this out so that while you're pouring concrete, you're pouring it in the right place, right? So we have this deployed internally and we're testing it amongst users from September to October. And a lot of the feedback initially is super positive, right? It's way easier to click a button now than it was to drive around in this clunky spreadsheet and do this thing in 3 different places, which is a huge win. There was some other mixed feedback in places where maybe the view wasn't as intuitive, or there's a conditioning that happened around a prior tab in the spreadsheet, and I don't know how to accomplish that same thing on a new view in this web application. And much of that was just user training, right? We want to make this sticky, and it is kind of sticky by nature because it's a daily planning tool around operational processes that we have a massive internal mandate to go and get in place. Then after the UAT window is closed, because we're comfortable with the day-to-day and the week-to-week use cases and it's fully operationalized, it's time to start thinking about 30-day, 60-day, 180-day kinds of questions, more of the resource management or portfolio management type concerns that were addressed in those second set of use cases I mentioned earlier. And that's where a lot of the traction reporting enhancements, the views that were shown in blue earlier, started to shake out. And it was just, the Caterpillar method of continuously building a view, testing it for feedback, and then deploying it to the application. And we had all of those in place by December of 2020. We had this thing stitched up and more or less completed by the end of the 2020 fiscal year. And from that point on, it's just been system maintenance and support. And I would say that the support has been relatively minimal. It's been very little need for additional care and feeding. The only ad hoc instances I can think of are something like re-indexing SQL records for assignments, because that's a higher volume record type inside the system. If you've got one person who gets assigned a task, but that task requires 3 people, that's 3 different assignments. You do that enough times throughout a span of several weeks, 2, 3, 4 years, those assignments pile up, and then you either got to scale vertically with your cloud resources to handle the data, or change the way you're storing the data so that you can keep going on an existing resource base. And so that's really the only kind of changes I've had to make since then. All right, so now let's take a tour of the model home. Start off, we've got a backlog view here with very little differences from the tab that was initially built in the workbook, with the exception of the repeating cadence on a particular task. So I create a task once, I set its cadence, and then that task will automatically show up in future proposed sprints when we're doing sprint planning. Here you can see what the sprint planning view looked like, something that I used a lot as a sprint planner inside of HighGround. And it's very much drawing on Trello. This is a card-based drag and drop exercise where most of the time a task might go to a single individual and you just drag and drop, but other times, to address our blockage concern, you're gonna have tasks that get split across multiple people and they're requiring inputs from each other to complete the work. So we had the ability to split that task out in assignments to multiple resources. And as you do this, you're going to see that each of the resources, each of the columns in this view, their capacity bar is going to fill from left to right. And you can clearly see their stated capacity in hours and their target billable utilization for the sprint, which we would manage against in the span of our hour together doing sprint planning for the next upcoming week. Here you can see, again, basically a Trello board, moving work from left to right in a drag and drop card-based approach, and I want to call special attention to the buttons on each card. This was a strong point of feedback from our users to say, I want to be able to update the estimates on a card based off new information. For the same reasons, I might want to defer a card or cancel because of those reactive client-based things I described earlier, or new information that comes to light. I want to be able to see descriptions on the work provided from a sprint planner or from another team member who might know more about it than I do. And then that pause button, hugely important. That's the blockages that we wanted to address. Anytime someone pushed that button, that card would get painted over with black and yellow hazard tape, very hard to miss styling, so that on any big visual chart that we were relying on for our daily stand-ups, on any week-to-week reporting, anywhere, if the team could see it, it would register as a blockage and get resolved almost instantly. So we took blockages down from maybe they lasted 2 to 3 days if there wasn't a whole lot of shared line of sight into the work being done, to maybe a matter of hours, whatever the time between the person's first check and last check of their boards inside of this application were. That's usually enough time for somebody to have an out-of-band conversation over Teams, or send an email, or have a call. And if it carried over long enough into the daily stand-up the following day, it would show up on the big visual chart and get resolved in a matter of 5 minutes. It's a mutual discussion of what obstacles are there that we have to overcome so that we can get you unblocked and get this work done. Another hugely impactful view was the timesheet view, so that you can make bulk edits to the time spent on all the different tasks that were assigned to you in the span of a single sprint. Something that I used a lot. And if you have a large number of tasks that you're responsible for that may not be huge in scope, this was also immensely valuable. It took something that might have been a significant amount of overhead and vigilance inside of the Excel workbook to manage effectively, down to something that you could complete in less than 2 minutes in the application if you're doing it on a daily basis. Moving into our management and reporting views, this is the big visual chart I made mention of earlier that we relied on heavily during our daily stand-ups so that we could make midweek course corrections as we go. It's tracking two different things. We've got the speedometer up top reporting a burn up of the hours that are actually being expended to date by each resource versus the hours that were estimated in the span of their share of the sprint. And then we've got task level tracking showing the status of each task, where those blockages would stand out like a sore thumb, and a visual height indicator for what proportion of that person's total sprint that task took up. Then we've got our implementation inside the application here for that actual versus expected velocity concept we explored in the workbook earlier, now being tracked over time. And this concept gets communicated a little bit better with that candlestick version of the graph down below, where things are color coded by the variance that was actually incurred. You know, red, you're out of control; blue, you're on the bubble; and green, you're in control and you've got things dialed in. Now, this showed us pretty early on some things we didn't have clear insight into. You know, we could extrapolate things like seasonal availability of work from certain clients. We could extrapolate wild swings in resource capacity because of life events, because people were pulling kids out of school. We're going through a global pandemic at the time. So we could dope up or dope down the amount of work we expected to complete realistically based off of backward-looking trends and forward-looking trends with the data we were collecting on a much tighter time cycle. Here we've got our account management views, and this was also really important. It showed us a lot because one of the things we noticed right away, if you track the green and the orange bars, the green showing the amount of hours people were contributing to a particular account or a particular project, and orange being the extrapolated average billable rate as a result of those hours being spent. If you're on a fixed bid engagement or you're with a client where your month-to-month service rates on a contract are already defined, we all know the squeaky wheel is going to get the grease. If someone's demanding a lot of resources and attention on something, well, you have another ideal dream client elsewhere that's consuming well within their budget, or maybe they're under consuming and you might miss a final expected deliverable because it's not happening in a quick enough clip. You want to be able to see that. So we were able to catch this and start to monitor both our margin account performance and the rate at which deliverables are being completed for clients in a much more consistent fashion, and really start to dial in and focus on the quality and the quantity of service delivery and bring up our overall margin. Here you can see the distribution of time being spent in different work categories by, you know, what was the target for the quarter and what was the actual being expended to date. So we could use this both as a burn-up chart, but we could also use this to see where disproportionate amounts of time were going and manage overhead, because some of these categories are inherently productive and inherently billable, and they bring in new capabilities and new revenue for the shop, and others are just standard work that if we can minimize it wherever possible or automate it wherever possible, we can save everyone headache and save potential cost. This applies the same basic concept but on a per resource basis, so we can see what each individual is contributing to those different work categories and whether or not they're over or under allocating to certain kinds of work based off of those predetermined targets, and catch potential overages or things that aren't going to plan. All right, let's wrap it up with some final benefits. The variance between planned and actual velocity decreased from something like plus or minus 40% to plus or minus 5% in the span of a single quarter. What that looked like in reality was a single resource with a stated capacity of 40 hours a week no longer had weeks whipsawing back and forth between a 30-hour week one week and a 65-hour week the next. It was plus or minus 3 hours from your stated capacity in the span of a single quarter. The average task blockage got reduced from 2.5 days to less than a day, and sometimes less than an hour. The higher completion rates and the actual velocity on the tasks that really mattered is shown through almost immediately. People could more appropriately prioritize work based off of stated priorities in the sprint planning, and they could pivot back and forth quickly out of tasks that were blocked, and the shared line of sight allowed them to remain blocked for less time. We had a professional services win here because the service quality and the consistency increased as a result of being able to see the reports that I showed earlier. We were able to regain some operational control over our account margin performance, and we were able to more effectively allocate attention to accounts that were over-consuming or under-consuming. And we got a management win here because for the first time in the company's history, we had a single solution with vertical integration between the executive resource management concerns and the sprint planning concerns, and information flow from the bottom up and the top down at the same time, so long as we followed these operational processes and entered all of this data into the platform that only got more robust with age. All right, if you made it this far, congratulations. Thanks for watching. My name is Ethan Barnhart. I'm the founder of Vulcan Digital Solutions. And if you empathize with the problem at all, if you like what you saw, if you want similar benefits for your organization or got things you want to work on, my contact information is on the screen here. Feel free to reach out. Let's start a conversation. Stay safe. Have a good one.